There are moments in history when the world holds its breath, when one strike, one decision, one whispered word behind closed doors decides whether we wake up to peace or descend into fire. This was one of those moments. For days, missiles flew and threats echoed louder than ever. The world watched as two giants stood face to face, each armed with power capable of turning entire nations into ash. And then, just as the edge of catastrophe loomed, the unthinkable happened. In a small, quiet room in Qatar, voices once filled with rage began to speak in whispers. Enemies who once vowed destruction sat across from one another, knowing full well that one wrong word could end it all. But why did Iran suddenly halt its strikes? What secret pressures moved behind the curtains? What invisible forces bent the course of history away from the edge? And most importantly, how fragile is this so-called peace we now cling to? Because what you're about to hear is not the story on your newsfeed. This is the story behind the story. The secret chessboard where power, fear, pride, and survival collide in ways the world rarely sees. Stay with me, because once you understand what truly unfolded behind those closed doors, you'll see just how close we came to disaster, and how quickly the calm we feel today could vanish tomorrow. The world often forgets how quickly the thin thread of peace can snap. For years, the tension between Iran and the United States had simmered like a pot left too long on the fire. Every sanction, every covert operation, every assassination was another twist in the tightening coil. But then, in a single night, that coil finally sprung loose. Iran launched a bold strike against a U.S. base, crossing a line most believed it would never dare approach. And in that moment, everything changed. News traveled faster than missiles. Within minutes, the headlines lit up across every corner of the globe. The world, already weary from years of conflict, suddenly stood paralyzed at the possibility of something far more terrifying. A war that could pull in not just nations, but entire regions, economies, millions of lives. The fear was palpable. It spread through financial markets, crashed oil prices, and flooded the airwaves. Leaders in Europe scrambled to make urgent phone calls. Generals in Washington dusted off contingency plans written for wars nobody wanted. In Moscow, Beijing, and Tel Aviv, intelligence services worked through the night, calculating what came next. The fear wasn't rooted in just one more battle. It was the knowledge that this conflict had the power to ignite a chain reaction none of them could fully control. This was not a fight between two small factions in a distant land. This was a direct collision between powerful nations, armed with massive militaries, global alliances, and long memories. It was the kind of moment history teaches us to fear, because history has seen it before. The assassination of leaders, the bold strikes, the rhetoric escalating on both sides. These are the ingredients that have cooked wars far greater than any single decision maker imagined at the time. And yet, even as the world teetered on the edge, something deeper was unfolding. Beneath the public statements and the blaring headlines, quiet conversations had already begun. The weight of what was at stake became impossible to ignore. Too much had been built, too many lives hung in the balance, and too many powers stood to lose far more than they could gain. The world had reached its breaking point, where one more move could plunge millions into darkness. That is when the quiet work of diplomacy began to stir, because in the face of disaster, even the fiercest enemies must sometimes choose to speak. The storm had not yet broken, But the sky had darkened enough to force the world's most bitter rivals to take a breath, to pause, and to face the reality of what full-scale war would truly cost. In a world dominated by giants, sometimes it's the smallest voices that hold the key to survival. While the great powers rattled their sabers, it was Qatar, a small dot on the map, that quietly stepped forward into the storm. Situated between competing interests, Qatar has long mastered the art of walking delicate lines. Its wealth, its gas fields, and its carefully cultivated relationships gave it something most larger nations lacked in that moment: trust from both sides. When Iran's missiles struck the U.S. base and the world spiraled toward the abyss, the noise grew deafening. But in the middle of that chaos, Qatar kept its silence. It didn't scream into microphones or fuel the fire with bold speeches. It simply opened its doors. Behind thick walls, far from the cameras, the first secret messages traveled back and forth. They carried no threats, no ultimatums, just one shared truth that both sides understood, even if they dared not admit it publicly. This path could not continue. Qatar's history as a neutral broker made it a safe harbor in a sea of distrust. Both Iran and the United States knew that Qatar wouldn't exploit its role for cheap headlines or political points. Instead, it offered something far more valuable in moments of crisis: discretion. In the stillness of those private rooms, old adversaries sat within the same walls, separated not by distance but by years of suspicion. Every word was measured, every glance carried weight. It was not friendship that brought them together, but survival. The talks were not easy. Pride remained thick in the air. Each side carried its own stories of betrayal, its own list of wounds too deep to forget. But when a nation stands on the edge of war, even the most bitter enemies must sometimes find the courage to speak words they would rather swallow. Qatar provided the space for those words. The world outside watched in panic, speculating whether war was now unavoidable. Few knew that inside these quiet rooms, a fragile thread of hope was being carefully woven, not out of trust, but out of necessity. Both sides understood the stakes. For Iran, war would risk everything its leaders had spent decades building. For the United States, it threatened to drag another generation into a conflict with no clear end. As these back-channel talks unfolded, a strange calm began to ripple outward. The angry rhetoric from podiums softened. The threats grew more cautious. And while the public still braced for the worst, inside those rooms, the seeds of the ceasefire were quietly being planted. Sometimes, in the moments when the world is screaming, the most important work happens in silence. Qatar knew this, and in offering that silence, it may have helped pull the world back from the edge of disaster. While the world focused on the two nations standing toe-to-toe, it was easy to forget that powerful forces beyond their borders were quietly shaping every move. The strike on the U.S. base did not only concern Washington and Tehran, it sent shockwaves through every corner of the global order. And behind the scenes, the world's most powerful players wasted no time making their positions clear. In Moscow, Russian leaders recognized the dangerous opportunity unfolding before them. A direct U.S.-Iran war could drain American resources, weaken alliances, and shift global power balances. But even Russia understood that a full-scale conflict risked destabilizing the entire region, sending waves of chaos toward its own borders. Russia's message to both parties was subtle but firm. Escalation would serve no one. In Beijing, China watched with its usual quiet calculation. Its growing dependence on Middle Eastern energy made stability in the region a matter of national survival. The flames of war could cripple trade routes, collapse oil markets, and send global supply chains into disarray. China, too, applied pressure, urging restraint while offering itself as a neutral voice of reason. In Europe, fear gripped leaders who had seen the Middle East burn before. They knew war would not stay contained within the desert sands. Refugee waves would flood European borders, economies already stretched thin would break, and alliances would fracture under the weight of new crises. Their message was urgent and desperate. The war must be stopped before it begins. These global powers did not act out of charity or moral conviction. They acted because their own interests were threatened. Yet their combined voices created an undeniable force behind the fragile diplomacy taking place in Qatar. Quiet phone calls crossed oceans. Private envoys delivered warnings. Intelligence agencies shared assessments designed not to inflame tensions, but to reveal the terrifying scope of what could unfold. And slowly, both Iran and the United States felt the weight of that global pressure. The room for reckless pride grew smaller. The reality of what a true war could unleash became harder to ignore. Every leader involved knew that the modern world is far more fragile than it appears on the surface. The collapse of one region can send tremors across continents. Markets do not respect borders. Refugees do not wait for permission to flee. Violence does not ask which nation started the fight before it spreads suffering. This global intervention did not guarantee peace, but it applied enough pressure to slow the march toward war. As the emergency talks in Qatar unfolded, the looming presence of these major powers hovered over every word spoken, every deal considered, in a conflict that could have shattered the world's fragile balance. The quiet but undeniable influence of global powers became an invisible hand, gently pulling the brakes on a train racing toward disaster. Iran's decision to enter the talks was not a surrender, but a calculation. The world saw missiles flying and bases burning, but behind those images lay a leadership playing a far more dangerous and delicate game. Iran had made its point. Its strike had reverberated through the corridors of Washington, shaken global markets, and reminded the world that even a sanctioned, cornered nation could still project force. But Iran's leaders understood that raw defiance, while powerful, has its limits. Full-scale war would not only test their military strength, but threaten the very foundations of the state they had carefully built over decades. The Islamic Republic of Iran was born out of revolution, out of defiance against foreign control. Its identity has always been tied to resistance. But beneath the slogans and the chants lies a sophisticated leadership that knows survival is the ultimate victory. A war with the United States would bring destruction not just to military targets, but to cities, infrastructure, and the fragile economy already strangled by years of sanctions. It would risk isolating Iran further, deepening the suffering of its people, and possibly threatening the regime itself. The leadership weighed these risks carefully. They understood that while they had demonstrated the capacity to strike back, a prolonged war would open doors to forces even they might not control. Proxy groups could ignite wider conflicts. Regional powers would seize opportunities. The cost of pride unchecked could spiral into devastation that no victory could justify. So, when Qatar offered a quiet room and a chance to talk, Iran stepped in, not with weakness, but with cold calculation. They came to the table knowing they had already shifted the global narrative. No longer were they seen as passive victims of American power. They had stood up, struck back, and forced even the world's strongest military to consider diplomacy. That was its own kind of victory. Entering the talks allowed Iran to freeze the conflict while preserving its image of strength. It gave them room to regroup, to negotiate for potential relief, and to prevent a war that could undo everything they had built. This was not the first time Iran played this game. Over decades, it has mastered the art of walking the tightrope between confrontation and negotiation, between defiance and diplomacy. And once again, as the world watched in fear, Iran's leadership made its move, not by firing more missiles, but by carefully pulling back, signaling to the world that it was willing to talk, but on its own terms. In doing so, Iran demonstrated that true power is not always in the strike itself, but in knowing when to strike, when to stand firm, and when to pause before the storm becomes too large to control. In Washington, behind the polished podiums and the carefully chosen words, a quieter dilemma was unfolding. For all the strength America possessed, the unmatched military, the global alliances, the economic dominance, this moment forced a deeper reckoning. Iran had crossed a line. They had struck a U.S. base directly, and every instinct inside the halls of power screamed for retaliation. There were voices demanding overwhelming force, insisting that to not respond with decisive power would embolden not just Iran, but every adversary watching from the shadows. The logic was familiar. Strength must be met with strength. Yet the costs of that strength weighed heavy in private conversations. After decades of wars in the Middle East, America's appetite for another prolonged conflict was thin. The American people had grown weary of body bags, endless deployments, and battles that seemed to resolve nothing while draining lives, resources, and political will. The leadership knew the danger of appearing weak, but they also understood the far greater danger of plunging headfirst into a war with a nation as deeply entrenched, as regionally connected, and as ideologically driven as Iran. Striking back would ignite not just one battlefield, but potentially a dozen across the Middle East. Iran's proxies stood ready, Hezbollah's missiles, Iraq's militias, Yemen's fighters. Each one represented a front that could light up within hours of a larger conflict erupting. And beyond the military costs, there was the risk to global stability. Oil markets were already jittery. Financial markets trembled with each new headline. Allies in Europe pleaded for restraint, fearing the flood of refugees and economic collapse that would follow. Russia and China, watching closely, stood ready to exploit any U.S. miscalculation for their own gain. For the United States, the choice was not between war and peace. It was between a rapid response that might spiral out of control and a strategic pause that could preserve its strength without opening another unwinnable conflict. This was a moment where true power was measured not by how many bombs could be dropped, but by how carefully the trigger could be avoided. The option to strike remained on the table. It always does for a superpower. But exercising that power without wisdom can turn strength into vulnerability. Washington's leadership recognized this fragile balance. They knew that restraint today could preserve leverage tomorrow, that avoiding a war now did not mean surrender, but rather a strategic calculation to fight battles on more favorable terms, if ever truly necessary. The world saw restraint as hesitation, but in truth, this was the quiet, difficult face of modern power, understanding that sometimes the strongest move is not pulling the trigger, but holding it steady in the face of immense pressure. The world may have exhaled at the news of a ceasefire, but deep beneath that surface calm, the storm still rumbles. A ceasefire is not peace. It is not resolution. It is only a pause, a fragile thread holding back forces that remain restless, waiting for the next misstep, the next insult, the next provocation to snap that thin line once again. Both Iran and the United States stepped back from the edge, but they did not walk away from the battlefield entirely. The grievances remain layered in years of mistrust, bloodshed, sanctions, and political maneuvering that go far beyond this one confrontation. Iran still sees itself surrounded, sanctioned, and threatened by the very powers that now call for restraint. The United States still views Iran as a destabilizing force, spreading its influence through proxies and undermining American allies throughout the region. The ceasefire may stop the missiles, but it cannot erase the decades of suspicion that fuel every decision. This fragile calm rests not on trust, but on calculations, on the understanding that both sides have more to lose than to gain from immediate war. But that calculation can change with one single spark. A miscalculation, a rogue actor, a misunderstanding on some distant border can set fire to the powder once more. The proxies remain in place, their weapons ready, their fighters waiting. The military assets of both nations continue their watchful movements across the seas and skies of the region. Intelligence agencies stay on high alert, scanning for signs that the fragile balance may tilt. The global powers who push for restraint breathe easier for now, but even they know how temporary this calm might be. Russia, China, Europe, they all understand that these old rivalries are not solved by one night of talking in Qatar. These tensions are born from deep, complex histories that cannot be erased with one ceasefire agreement. The people of the region, too, live with this fragile peace. Civilians who have known war, who have lost homes, family, members, and futures to these endless cycles of conflict know that quiet can be deceiving. They have seen ceasefires before, only to watch them collapse under the weight of unhealed wounds and unkept promises. The world watches, grateful for the moment of quiet, but knowing full well that the next crisis may already be quietly building. This is the reality of modern conflict, where even peace feels temporary, where even victory feels fragile. The ceasefire, confirmed in Qatar, bought the world time, but it did not buy security. The real challenge remains ahead. Whether the leaders on both sides can break free from the patterns of history, or whether they will once again repeat them, dragging their nations and the world back to the edge of fire. And so, for now, the guns fall silent. The skies, once streaked with missiles, grow dark again. The ships drift quietly in tense waters. The diplomats return to their capitals, carrying with them fragile agreements, inked under immense pressure. The world steps back from the edge, but not because trust was rebuilt, or not because both sides looked into the abyss and recognized the horror waiting below. The ceasefire, confirmed after tense hours in Qatar's quiet halls, is not a final chapter. It is merely a comma in a long, unfinished sentence. Iran stands, having proved that it will not bow easily, its defiance still burning beneath the surface. America watches, knowing its strength remains vast, but its will to wage another war grows thin. Around them, the world holds its breath, knowing this fragile peace is held together, not by trust, but by the thin thread of mutual survival. The questions remain unanswered. Will pride ignite the flame once again? Will ambition overshadow wisdom? Or will both sides find the rare courage to break the cycle history has written so many times before? Only time will tell. But for now, the world sleeps a little easier, though no one dares to sleep too deeply, because storms, even when they fade, never disappear completely. They wait, and when the wind shifts again, they rise. Thank you for standing with me through this journey. In times like these, understanding is not a luxury. It's a responsibility. Stay curious, stay aware, and may we all hope that wisdom continues to guide those who hold the power to shape peace or war. Good luck, and thank you.